Okay, today I'm in London at the Levy Board HQ with Alan Delmonte. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us today, Alan. So, 1st of April, it all changed for you guys, didn't it?
Well, it didn't. That's the first surprise. We'd been expecting to be abolished in April this year, and that's been something that's was on the cards for a few years. And quite a lot of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years was getting ready for not being here. But that's all changed now. The plan to abolish the Levy Board was shelved in the early part of this year. The government's plan, or the way the government planned to do it, didn't work. So it's back to the drawing board, and now it's an interesting, exciting time for us because we're starting to come out of the cave, blinking into the light, and thinking about our future and getting ourselves ready for the next chapter.
Okay, so why did the government want to change things after 50 odd years of?
Well, I think the Levy Board's history has been one that's been punctuated by attempts to get rid of it on and off. Racing has had an understandable, long-held ambition to get hold of the levy money, and different attempts have been made to try and do that. All of them haven't worked for one reason or another. The latest one came about for a number of reasons, but as part of government's desire to streamline in the public sector, after a long consultation process, it came to a view that the Levy Board's functions could be transferred out to an existing body on the collection side, to the Gambling Commission, and the distribution of the money would go directly to racing. In the end, the savings that was likely to make actually weren't going to be that great. Getting rid of one body and creating two is always going to lead to some reduction in your cost saving. But as much as anything, it was about trying to give racing direct control of the expenditure. And where it went wrong is the parliamentary committees that looked at the options, or the proposed way of doing it, came to a view that it was better to leave a public body in place doing the job of looking after what are public funds, and that's something that we have always taken very seriously. They didn't stop being publicly raised monies just because you were giving the money over to racing. So the option of having another go and getting rid of the Levy Board is still there for the government, and those arguments can all be run in the future. But for now, we're focusing on doing our job of collecting, distributing the levy, making sure that what we do is transparent and open, cost effective, and trying to give confidence to the betting industry, to racing, and to the government that we're managing those funds properly.
Okay, now I understand that you're actually formed when betting shops became legal to compensate for the expected downturn in attendances on racecourses. Can you just explain what in 2000 now you do? What is the general business day for the Levy Board?
Well, at its simplest, don't tell anyone it's this easy, but we collect money from bookmakers and spend it on racing, and that's the job. More technically, we collect 10% of the gross profit of bookmakers who have taken bets on British racing from British-based punters, and at the end of the year, that money is collected around this time of year, April time, from bookmakers, or the final amount is collected this year, and then we spend that money on racing on a whole range of things through the year. So last year we raised about 95 million. That's a big increase on what it was in the years before 2017. We've just extended the levy to bookmakers outside Britain, which was a change that took a long time coming, but has now put the finance of the Levy Board on a much better footing. And we provide a substantial sum towards the prize money for every racecourse. We provide about 2/3 of the regulation cost, several million in equine welfare and veterinary research, several million for racing industry staff training and so on. So what we do is try to support what racing is doing in a number of its key areas and apply that money in a sensible, where we can, measurable, cost-effective way.
Okay, you mentioned the extra money now from 2016-17, when you after that you started to be able to get money from the offshore bookmakers. That's like nearly 50 million, well, 45 million pounds extra. So all those years previously that you couldn't collect it, that's an awful lot of money that racing lost. What is there any reason why?
Yeah, for a very long time, let's go back right to the 1960s. The legislation that governs the Levy Board has been around since the 60s and was pretty much unchanged since it began. And when the levy was formed, as you say, as a compensation for racing, almost all betting was done in Britain with bookmakers based in Britain. So the question of trying to capture money from outside Britain was a non-issue. And it became an issue, a growing issue, with first of all some telephone operators moving outside of Britain, but then particularly from the early to mid-2000s as bookmakers moved their online businesses out of Britain. The levy legislation just couldn't cope with it. And one of the problems that we had was that we couldn't unilaterally change the legislation. It's Parliament that changes legislation. And because the levy was such an old piece of legislation, the advice that government had always had was that you couldn't easily change the legislation without creating what is known as a state aid in European law. So we wrote to the government in 2010 to say, unless something happened to change the legislation, the levy yield would continue to go down. And it was difficult for government to act. But what changed was there was a 2013 decision in Europe that seemed to open the way for the changes to be made to the levy legislation. That, combined with a number of politicians who were very keen to help modernise the levy structure, plus some work by racing in pressing home that advantage, led to a real momentum behind the change happening. So really from about 2015, we knew that unless it fell over a legal hurdle, the levy would get extended, and it came in April 17. So we're now getting a lot of extra money in, as you say, 40 million plus from bookmakers outside Britain. We did have a number of voluntary deals in place through the early to mid 2010s that mitigated some of that lost revenue. But really, I think as everybody could recognise, it was only by actually changing the law to extend the levy completely that you can really get the full amount of the money in.
Yeah, so a lot of bookmakers got away with a lot of money for a long time. So does it fall a little bit on deaf ears when they're screaming now that they're going to lose lots of revenue, because of the FOBTs, and they're going to get to close betting shops and all the rest of it? I mean, they should have plenty in reserve, shouldn't they?
Not really, because number one, the bookmakers were doing what the law said, and the law was that if you weren't in Britain, you didn't pay. Number two, not all of the bookmakers that were not paying are the same bookmakers that have retail estates. So I don't think anybody's really looking back at what happened. I think there is a real obvious issue coming up for the betting industry, the retail betting industry, and for racing, with the FOBT changes that have come in April. We know that there is going to be a significant effect on revenues to racing from media rights, and obviously revenues to bookmakers first of all, and then that's a knock-on effect onto racing. To what extent the levy is affected is more difficult to predict, even if you knew that X number of shops were going to close, because you don't know exactly which shops will close. The media rights contracts, although we don't know the exact detail of every contract, pretty much every shop that closes will lead to a reduction in income. Whereas in a levy environment, because it's based on gross profit, if some of the business from a shop moves to another shop or moves online, then the damage to the levy will be more limited. But at the moment, we're finding it quite difficult to be very precise in our forecasts. All that we've said to our board is that we know that there will be an impact. It won't be as severe as the impact more generally, so we should be cautious about what we commit to spend. But beyond that, we haven't said that it's something that needs, for the Levy Board at the moment, a massive rethinking of expenditure. It's more a case of being very alert and alive to what's happening, monitoring shop closures as they happen.
Okay, now when that massive windfall, well, not windfall, extra revenue started to come in, where did you prioritise that money?
The number one priority was not to spend all of it, because the Levy Board had drawn on its reserves for a number of years. At one point, I think when I started here 9 years ago, reserves were in the 60 million level, and they've gradually gone down, and at one point hit just under 20 million in around 2017, just before the law changed to extend the levy overseas. We'd pretty much hit the bottom of the barrel. So we and the board were very keen to ensure that while the benefits of the levy were immediately felt, the increase was felt, that was a good time to start to rebuild what we had. So we've managed to get reserves up in that 2-year period from around 20 million to around 50 million. But at the same time, this year, we've been able to, particularly this year, 2019, have been able to spend considerably more. And the main focus has been on prize money, but the key point about the prize money is that it was aimed and has been aimed at the middle to lower tiers of the sport. I think it's really important that people recognise that how much of the levy income is derived from day-to-day racing. I think people are often surprised in a good way that it's the repetitive nature of 3 fixtures a day, 4 on Saturdays, 2 evenings and 1 or 2 twilights. That's what keeps the wheels turning. And important as the big festivals are, Grand National, Cheltenham, Royal Ascot, those 3 festivals combined probably wouldn't generate more than 5 to 7% of the levy. It's the day in, day out racing that keeps things going, and for that to keep going, you've got to ensure there's sufficient reward for people there. But at the same time, of course, we know that it's the top races that are the big generators for commercial interest in the sport, sponsorship and race going. So what we're trying to do all the time is find a way of balancing the things that we spend the money on to come up with as close as you can to an optimum spread of fixtures and revenue across the sport.
Okay, I'm guessing from that then that you don't agree with a lot of the criticism that there's too much racing. Your figures would suggest that you need it to keep going.
Yeah, I think it's easy to say that. Well, in fact, it's easy to say both things. It's easy to say there's too much racing, and it's easy to say you should have more fixtures, because to some extent you can't really prove either of those things is not true. But it's certainly easier to prove the argument for more racing being better than less. And the Levy Board has been absolutely at the forefront of growing the fixture list in recent years. I'm absolutely sure that has led to racing's income in total going up. In part, that's because the media rights model, and bearing in mind that racing now gets more in media rights than it does in levy, while those media rights models are based largely on the volume of racing, it's very attractive to add more fixtures on. So I think the argument for cutting is more difficult, and you really have to show that by cutting there's going to be some benefit to the sport. That's much more difficult. Of course, the sport's got to have enough horses, enough people, but and you can't underestimate that. Obviously, the sport can't operate without them, but it's much more difficult to make the argument positively for reducing your income, because we know pretty much that if you cut fixtures, you cut media rights income and you cut levy.